Most people hear the phrase emotional intelligence and immediately imagine something noble. They think of empathy, kindness, patience, understanding. They picture someone who can walk into a room and sense tension before anyone says a word. Someone who knows exactly when to speak, when to comfort, when to encourage. And on the surface, these look like strengths. They are strengths. But there is a hidden danger inside emotional intelligence that almost nobody talks about. Because emotional intelligence can become a survival strategy. And the moment a strength becomes a survival strategy, it stops serving you and starts controlling you. Many empaths did not become emotionally intelligent because they simply had a deep interest in human nature. They became emotionally intelligent because somewhere early in life, paying attention to emotions felt necessary. A child learns very quickly how the emotional climate around them works. They learn who gets angry, who withdraws, who becomes unpredictable, who becomes cold. They learn which facial expressions signal danger and which ones signal safety. Without realizing it, they become experts in emotional weather patterns. They can feel shifts in energy before words are spoken. They can detect disappointment from a change in someone's voice. They can sense discomfort hidden beneath a smile. People later call this a gift. They say, "You're so emotionally aware. You're so understanding. You always know what people need." But what if that awareness wasn't developed from freedom? What if it was developed from necessity? There is a profound difference between reading emotions because you choose to and reading emotions because your nervous system believes it has to. One is awareness. The other is vigilance. And vigilance is exhausting. Because when emotional intelligence becomes tied to survival, the empath slowly starts disappearing from their own life. Their attention constantly moves outward. How does this person feel? Are they upset? Did I say something wrong? Do they need reassurance? Are they pulling away? Should I explain myself better? Notice something interesting here. The empath becomes highly educated in everyone else's emotional world while becoming strangely disconnected from their own. They know everyone else's needs, but they struggle to identify their own. They understand everyone else's pain, but they minimize their own pain. They can explain another person's behavior with incredible precision, yet when asked a simple question, "What do you want?" they suddenly become uncertain. Because for years, their emotional compass has been pointed away from themselves. Philosophically, this creates an interesting problem. Human beings are meant to connect with others, but connection was never designed to require self-erasure. Real empathy was never meant to become emotional disappearance. Yet, many people unconsciously believe that being good means being endlessly available. They believe understanding others means carrying others. They believe compassion means enduring everything. But understanding someone's wounds does not require you to volunteer for your own suffering. Read that again in your mind. Because many empaths confuse explanation with responsibility. If someone acts cold, they explain it. If someone becomes distant, they justify it. If someone repeatedly crosses boundaries, they analyze childhood experiences, stress, trauma, pressure, and fear. And while they are busy understanding everyone else, they slowly become strangers to themselves. The irony is almost painful. The very thing that made them extraordinary begins draining the life out of them. Because emotional intelligence without boundaries eventually becomes emotional self-abandonment. And self-abandonment always starts quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive as some dramatic collapse. It appears in small moments. The moments where you ignore your discomfort. The moments where you silence your needs. The moments where you keep explaining your value to people who have already decided not to see it. That's where the shift begins. Because the day emotional intelligence stops being a tool for understanding others and starts becoming a reason to abandon yourself, is the day wisdom turns into captivity. And no strength should ever require you to disappear. Once emotional intelligence turns outward for long enough, something subtle begins to happen. The empath starts developing a habit that looks compassionate on the surface but is often rooted in something much deeper. They begin explaining themselves constantly, explaining their intentions, explaining their feelings, explaining why they said something, why they reacted a certain way, why they pulled back, why they needed space, why they cared, and eventually they start explaining who they are. Watch this pattern carefully because it hides in plain sight. An empath walks into a disagreement and immediately feels tension building in the room. Their first instinct is rarely to defend themselves through force. Their instinct is to create understanding. They believe that if they can just communicate clearly enough, if they can find the perfect sequence of words, the misunderstanding will disappear. So they begin building emotional bridges. "I didn't mean it that way. Maybe I came across wrong. Let me explain what I was trying to say. I just want you to understand where I'm coming from." On the surface, that sounds healthy. Communication matters. Understanding matters. But there is a line people rarely talk about, and once you cross it, communication stops being communication and starts becoming negotiation. Now you're negotiating your own reality. Because the hidden assumption beneath constant explanation is this: if they understand me, then I will finally be okay. That's a dangerous belief, because it quietly hands emotional authority over to other people. Think about the psychology of it. When someone repeatedly explains themselves, they are often trying to reduce uncertainty. Human beings naturally dislike social tension. We dislike rejection. We dislike disconnection. But for many empaths, these experiences feel amplified because somewhere earlier in life they learned an unconscious lesson. Safety comes from keeping relationships stable, so they become experts at repair. They become the person who reaches out first after conflict, the person who smooths tension before it grows, the person who carries emotional responsibility for the room. And at first, people admire them for it. They seem mature, self-aware, understanding, but eventually something begins to feel heavy. Because they are not just communicating anymore. They are performing emotional labor for everyone around them. Here's where it gets interesting. People who genuinely want to understand you usually require very little explanation. They ask questions, they listen, they stay curious, they meet you halfway. People who are committed to misunderstanding you are different. No amount of clarity reaches them. You can explain your intentions 10 different ways. You can dissect your emotions with surgical precision. You can provide context, examples, evidence, history, and somehow the target keeps moving. Because understanding was never the objective. Control was. This is why so many empaths feel exhausted after certain relationships. Not because they gave too much love, but because they spent years standing in a courtroom where they were both the defendant and the defense attorney, constantly presenting evidence for their own humanity, constantly trying to prove they were kind enough, loyal enough, patient enough, worthy enough. And there is a philosophical trap hidden inside all of this. Human beings naturally want to be seen. We all do. We want another person to look at us and say, "I understand you." But there is a difference between wanting to be understood and needing permission to exist. One creates connection, the other creates dependency. The empath often doesn't notice when they cross that line because it happens gradually. They begin believing that if someone misunderstands them, they must work harder, speak more clearly, give more context, show more patience. But some people are not confused. They simply made a decision. And no amount of explanation changes a decision someone has already made. The day an empath realizes this, something shifts internally. Energy stops flowing toward proving and starts flowing toward observing. Because the people who deserve your presence will seek understanding. The people who demand endless explanation usually seek leverage. And the moment you stop defending your existence, you discover something powerful. Your value was never waiting at the end of someone else's understanding. If you follow this pattern far enough, eventually you arrive at a question that changes everything. Why does the empath feel responsible for maintaining emotional balance in the first place? Why does one person walk away from conflict and think we disagreed while another walks away thinking I need to fix this immediately? Because behaviors that repeat themselves are rarely random. Human beings are pattern-making creatures. We carry emotional blueprints long before we understand that we're carrying them. And most of these blueprints were written before we had any say in the process. This is where attachment enters the conversation. Attachment is not just a psychological theory sitting inside a textbook. It is the operating system beneath human behavior. It quietly shapes how we interpret love, safety, rejection, closeness, and distance. It becomes the invisible architecture behind our relationships. And the strange thing about attachment is that it doesn't teach us what love is. It teaches us what we believe we must do in order to receive it. Read that carefully. Because for many empaths, love did not arrive as something freely given. Love often arrived mixed with conditions they were too young to understand. Maybe attention came during moments of achievement. Maybe peace in the home depended on keeping everyone emotionally stable. Maybe expressing certain emotions created tension, criticism, or withdrawal. Maybe being easy, helpful, understanding, and emotionally aware became the safest role available. Children are brilliant observers. A child may not consciously think, "I need to become emotionally responsible for everyone around me." But they learn through repetition. If I stay quiet, things remain peaceful. If I take care of others, people stay close. If I understand everyone else, maybe I won't be rejected. And eventually survival strategies stop feeling like strategies. They start feeling like personality. That's the part that catches people by surprise. Many empaths proudly identify with being the peacemaker, the caretaker, the one who understands everyone, and these qualities can absolutely be beautiful. But sometimes what we call personality is actually adaptation wearing a mask, because adaptation repeated for years becomes identity. Now suddenly adulthood becomes confusing. The child who once learned to maintain emotional safety becomes the adult who feels responsible for everyone's emotions. The child who learned to anticipate tension becomes the adult constantly scanning for shifts in mood. The child who earned connection through emotional labor becomes the adult who feels uneasy receiving love without proving worth first. And here's the problem: the nervous system doesn't care whether you're 8 years old or 38 years old. If it learned that closeness required effort, it continues running that program. This explains why so many empaths feel strangely uncomfortable around healthy relationships. Think about that for a moment. Healthy relationships often feel calm, predictable, stable. But if chaos, uncertainty, or emotional management became familiar early in life, calmness can feel unfamiliar. And human beings often confuse familiarity with truth. We don't automatically move toward what's healthy. We often move toward what's familiar. That's why people sometimes repeat the same relationship dynamics with different faces, different names, different voices, different circumstances, same emotional pattern. Because unresolved attachment doesn't ask, what is good for me? It asks, what feels like home? Now, this is where people usually become discouraged because they start believing they are trapped by their past. They begin thinking, this is just who I am. But understanding the origin of a pattern is not the same thing as surrendering to it. Awareness changes everything. The moment you see the pattern, you stop calling it destiny. You stop confusing conditioning with identity. You stop believing that emotional exhaustion is proof of love. And maybe most importantly, you stop assigning yourself a job that never belonged to you. Because the empath was never meant to become the emotional architect of every relationship. The child adapted because adaptation was necessary. But the adult has another option. The adult can choose. And the most powerful moment in a person's life may be the moment they realize, just because something shaped you does not mean it gets to define you. Once someone begins recognizing these patterns, a very strange transition starts to happen. At first it feels uncomfortable, almost unnatural. Because for years, maybe decades, the empath believed their role was to explain, repair, reassure, and maintain emotional stability. Their identity was built around movement, reaching out, clarifying, smoothing tension, carrying conversations further than they needed to go. Then one day something changes. Not because they become colder, not because they stop caring, not because they suddenly lose their empathy. Something changes because they become tired of translating their soul into languages people were never trying to learn. And that is the moment silence enters. Now, when people hear the word silence, they often misunderstand it. They imagine withdrawal, resentment, emotional walls, punishment. They picture someone becoming distant or detached. But real silence is something very different. Silence is clarity without performance. Silence is the moment a person stops treating their existence like a debate. Because for years, the empath may have unconsciously lived with a belief that sounded something like this: if I explain myself well enough, people will finally understand me. If people understand me, they won't leave. If they don't leave, I am safe. Notice what happened there. Safety became attached to explanation. And whenever safety becomes attached to behavior, that behavior becomes compulsive. That's why many empaths feel anxiety when they stop explaining. The silence itself can feel dangerous. Their mind starts generating questions immediately. Should I say more? Maybe they misunderstood me. Maybe I should send another message. Maybe I should clarify what I meant. Because silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty activates old programming. But here's what becomes fascinating once you observe human behavior long enough. People reveal themselves most clearly in the spaces where you stop managing their perception. Think about it. When you constantly explain, reassure, and interpret, you become part of the machinery holding the relationship together. You are supplying emotional energy into a system. You are constantly adjusting the temperature of the room. But the moment you stop, something important happens. The room reveals its natural temperature. Suddenly you see who reaches toward understanding and who only reached toward convenience. You see who genuinely valued you and who simply valued access to your effort. You see who asks questions and who makes assumptions. You see who respects silence and who becomes uncomfortable when they can no longer control the narrative. Silence becomes a mirror, and mirrors make people nervous. Because many relationships survive not on truth, but on maintenance. They survive because one person continually absorbs tension, continually explains intentions, continually repairs fractures before anyone else even notices them. Remove that person from the process and reality becomes visible. This is why people sometimes react strongly when an empath changes. Some become confused. Some become frustrated. Some become angry. And it isn't always because the empath became different. Sometimes it's because the system became different. People grow accustomed to certain versions of us. They become familiar with our roles: the listener, the peacemaker, the emotional translator. And when those roles disappear, people suddenly have to confront themselves. Now, there is another philosophical layer beneath this. Silence forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human beings. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to our explanations. That sounds simple, but it changes everything, because explanation is energy. Attention is energy. Emotional labor is energy. And anything valuable requires discernment. The empath begins realizing that understanding people does not obligate them to endlessly educate people about their own worth. And that realization feels almost revolutionary, because now silence is no longer empty. Silence becomes self-respect. Silence becomes emotional confidence. Silence becomes the refusal to chase validation through endless words. The empath stops running after understanding and starts observing actions. And that is where power quietly returns. Because the strongest people in a room are rarely the ones speaking the most. They are often the ones who no longer feel the need to convince anyone of who they are. Because the moment you stop defending your value, your presence begins to speak for itself. And this is where the story changes in a way many people never expect. Because when an empath stops explaining, stops overfunctioning, stops carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to carry, they imagine life becoming quieter and easier overnight. But that isn't usually what happens first. What happens first is revelation. Because relationships operate like systems. Every relationship develops an unspoken structure over time. People unconsciously learn roles. One person becomes the pursuer, one becomes the listener, one becomes the fixer, one becomes the emotional center of gravity. And for many empaths, whether they realize it or not, they become the stabilizer. They become the one who notices tension before anyone else notices it. The one who sends the message first after distance appears. The one who smooths over misunderstandings. The one who explains intentions before accusations even arrive. For years, they become emotional architecture. And architecture is interesting because people usually don't notice it until it changes. No one walks into a building and spends time appreciating the support beams holding everything up. They notice them only when something shifts. The same thing happens in relationships. The day the empath stops over-explaining, people notice. The day the empath stops rushing to repair every crack, people notice. The day the empath becomes comfortable with silence, people notice. And their reactions tell you everything. Some people become curious. They ask questions. They lean closer. They want to understand. Healthy people often respond this way because healthy relationships are built on mutual participation. They don't depend on one person carrying emotional responsibility for two people. But others react differently. Some become restless. Some become irritated. Some become strangely demanding. Some suddenly accuse the empath of changing. And this creates confusion because the empath often thinks, wait a minute, I didn't become unkind. I didn't become cruel. I didn't become distant. No. They simply stop doing invisible work. And people become very aware of invisible work the moment it disappears. Psychologically, this is fascinating because human beings adapt quickly to whatever consistently benefits them. We normalize what we repeatedly receive. Attention becomes expected. Patience becomes expected. Understanding becomes expected. And when something expected disappears, people often interpret it as loss. Not because they lost love, because they lost access. There is a difference. Love says, I value who you are. Access says, I value what you provide. And silent power has a way of exposing that difference with uncomfortable precision. Because silence removes interference. Imagine trying to observe the surface of a lake while someone constantly stirs the water. You can't see much. The movement distorts everything. But once the movement stops, the surface becomes still. And stillness reveals what was already there. The empath who once filled every silence with reassurance suddenly begins observing rather than reacting. They stop chasing people who create distance. They stop over-explaining misunderstandings. They stop volunteering emotional labor where no emotional investment exists. And now people reveal themselves. Some disappear. Not because they were rejected, because the dynamic they depended on no longer exists. Some become frustrated because they can no longer control the emotional rhythm of the relationship, and some become closer than ever before because genuine connection survives truth. Actually, genuine connection becomes stronger in truth. This is why the day an empath discovers silent power is not the day they become smaller. It's the day they become visible. For years, they may have believed their value lived inside usefulness, inside understanding everyone else, inside fixing, caring, and maintaining. But usefulness and worth are not the same thing. One is something you give, the other is something you are. And once an empath understands this, relationships begin changing in ways that seem almost magical, not because the world changed, because they changed the standard for entry into their world. Because when you stop negotiating your value, stop performing for acceptance, and stop explaining your existence, something extraordinary happens. The people who truly see you stay, and everyone else finally reveals why they were there.